He stood over his best friend's grave in the Tennessee summer heat and made a promise no man should ever have to make. He told himself it would be simple. Find her, check on her, make sure she was all right. That was all. But when he finally saw her, standing alone at the edge of her own cousin's funeral, like she hadn't been invited to her own grief, something shifted inside Elias Voss that had been locked shut for years. If you've ever been told you were too much and not enough at the same time, this story is for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. She told him she understood. She told him that a dead man's wishes didn't bind a living one. She told him that Samuel wouldn't have wanted this, that it wasn't right, that he owed her nothing, not a single thing, and that she was releasing him from whatever obligation her cousin's last breath had placed on his shoulders. She said all of this with her hands folded in front of her, and her chin level, and her voice as steady as a woman who has spent 33 years practicing how to let people go. Elias Voss stood in the doorway of her aunt's roadhouse in Franklin, Tennessee, on the hottest morning of the summer of 1814, and he listened to every word. And when she was finished, he said, "You done?" Ruth Adler blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You done telling me what I want?" She stared at him. Behind her, somewhere in the back of the roadhouse, pots clanged, and her aunt's voice carried through the walls like a blade looking for something to cut. Elias stepped forward, not fast, not with force, the way a man steps forward when he has already made up his mind and knows the ground is solid beneath him. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep, and I don't take them back because they got inconvenient." Ruth's lips parted, then closed. Then she pressed them together and looked at him the way a woman looks at something she doesn't know how to categorize, something outside the borders of everything she has ever been taught to expect. "You don't even know me," she said. "No," Elias agreed. "But Samuel did." The name landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. And that was the moment Ruth Adler understood. She was in a great deal more trouble than she had prepared herself for. Samuel Adler had been dead for 6 weeks when Elias first rode to Franklin. He had put it off. Not because he didn't intend to go. He had always intended to go. But there was business in Nashville that couldn't wait, and a land dispute up near the Cumberland that needed his name on paper before somebody else put their name on the land. And a dozen other things that Elias Voss had used for 6 weeks to keep himself from riding to a roadhouse in Franklin and looking a dead man's cousin in the eye. He knew what Samuel had asked of him. He had been there when Samuel asked it. They'd been standing in a field outside of Nashville 2 days before the militia rode south, the summer air thick with the particular heat that settles on Tennessee in June like a second skin. Samuel had his rifle over one shoulder and his hat pushed back on his head, and he'd been looking at Elias with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has decided to say the thing he came to say. "I need to ask you something," Samuel said. "Then ask it." "It's about Ruth." Elias didn't know who Ruth was. He said as much. "My cousin, my mama's sister's girl." Samuel paused. He was not a man who chose words carelessly. "Her mama was Cherokee. Half, anyhow. My Aunt Constance never let Ruth forget it. Not once, not one day, her whole life." Elias waited. "She works the roadhouse in Franklin. Cooks, cleans, waits tables. Constance calls it room and board. Ain't paid her a wage in 3 years. Samuel's jaw tightened. "She ain't got no one, Elias. When I'm gone, if I don't come back, she's got nobody." "You're coming back," Elias said. "Maybe." Samuel didn't flinch. He was 36 years old, and he had been to war before. He knew what maybe meant. But I need to know someone's looking after her. Not charity, not pity. Something real, something that sticks. Elias studied him. What are you asking me, Sam? Samuel looked him square in the eye. Marry her. The field was silent for a moment, except for the insects in the grass. I know what I'm asking, Samuel said before Elias could speak. I know it ain't small. I'm not asking you to love her. I ain't asking for the impossible. I'm asking you to protect her. Give her your name. Give her a place to stand where her aunt can't reach her no more. He paused. She's the best person I know, Elias. The only one in that whole family worth a damn. She visited me every time I was sick, sat with me, listened, never once made me feel like I was a burden. His voice dropped. She deserves to have that back. Someone who won't make her feel like a burden. Elias thought about his land, his house, the 4,000 acres he had built from nothing with his hands and his will, and a particular willingness to be harder than the thing trying to break him. He thought about bringing a woman he had never met into that life. Sam, he said slowly. I know, Samuel said. I know what I'm asking. I wouldn't ask it if I thought there was another way. Elias looked at him. This man who had ridden into a burning supply depot 3 years ago and pulled him out by the collar when Elias's horse had gone down, and 3 men with rifles had been closing from the north. This man who had taken a tomahawk handle across the ribs doing it, and never once mentioned it after. There was nothing Elias Voss would not do for Samuel Adler, and they both knew it. All right, Elias said. Samuel's shoulders dropped half an inch, just half an inch, but Elias saw it. Promise me, Samuel said. I promise. Samuel nodded once. He put his hat back straight on his head. She won't ask for help, he said. She never does. You'll have to offer it. He rode out the next morning. He did not come back. The funeral was held at a small church on the edge of Franklin on a Saturday morning in July, the air already heavy and wet before 9 o'clock. Elias stood in the back because that was where he always stood, close to the door, with a clear line to the exits and a view of the room. He scanned the pews the way he had learned to scan every room in his life. Fast, thorough, looking for what didn't fit. The Adler family occupied the front rows. Constance sat rigid and dry-eyed in the first pew, her black dress pressed to a razor's edge, her face wearing the particular expression of a woman performing sorrow for an audience she has chosen carefully. Beside her sat a younger woman, blonde, pretty in the way that requires a great deal of effort, who kept glancing at the people around her to check whether she was being observed. And then Elias saw her. She was sitting at the end of the third pew, not beside the family, not included in the cluster of black-clad relatives who had arranged themselves up front like a portrait meant to prove how much they cared. She sat apart, alone, her dark hair pinned back, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the minister, with an expression that hit Elias somewhere under his ribs before he could prepare for it. She was not performing grief. She was inside it, living it. Her face was full and brown and soft around the edges, and she held herself very still, the way a woman holds herself still when she has learned that showing too much of what she feels costs something she can't afford to pay. She was not a small woman. She was solid and full-figured, and she wore a plain black dress that was clean and pressed and not expensive, and her only jewelry was a small silver cross at her throat that she kept touching with 2 fingers, the way you touch something that belonged to someone you miss. Elias watched her through the whole service. He watched the moment Constance leaned toward the woman beside her and said something behind her hand, and both of them glanced back at the end of the third pew. He watched Ruth see it. He watched something in her face go quiet and closed, like a shutter pulled across a window from the inside. After the service, people filed out slowly. Elias waited by the hitching post outside. He watched the family move together, pulling one another into embraces, accepting condolences, doing the work of grief that people do when they are seen. Ruth came out last. She stood on the church steps alone, blinking in the white summer glare. No one stopped to speak to her. No one took her hand. No one said, "He talked about you. He loved you. He was proud of you." She stood there for a long moment among people who shared her blood. Then she turned and started walking down the road. Elias pushed off the post and followed. She heard his boots on the packed dirt and turned fast, her brown eyes wide and careful. The automatic assessment of a woman who has learned to read the approach of strangers before she reads anything else. "Miss Adler," he said. She looked at him with that careful distance. "I don't believe we've met." "No, ma'am. My name is Elias Voss. I rode with your cousin." The shift in her face was immediate. The wariness softened. Not all the way. She was too smart for that. But enough. Her chin came up slightly. "Samuel talked about you," she said. "He talked about you, too." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, or the ghost of a feeling that couldn't quite survive the morning. "He shouldn't have," she said quietly. "There's not much to talk about." Elias studied her. He was not a man who formed quick opinions. He had lived too long in a world where quick opinions got people killed. But standing on a dirt road in Franklin, Tennessee, looking at this woman who spoke about herself like she was a footnote in someone else's story, Elias felt something move in him. "Can I walk with you a ways?" he asked. She hesitated. He could see her weighing it. "You don't have to do that," she said. Elias almost smiled. Almost. "Samuel told me you'd say that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and they walked. He found out she lived in a room above the roadhouse. A single room with a window that faced the stable yard, in a building her aunt owned, and her aunt's name was on the deed, and her aunt reminded her of 3 times a week. He found out she had worked there since she was 19. 14 years of cooking and cleaning and waiting tables for travelers, and never once being paid what the work was worth, because Constance Adler called it family obligation, and Ruth had not yet found the words to call it something else. He found out she read every book she could find. She borrowed them from the minister's wife and from a school teacher 2 miles east, and sometimes from travelers who left them behind by accident or by kindness. She read them by lamplight, after the kitchen was cleaned and the tables were set for the morning, and the rest of the house was asleep. He found out she could do sums faster in her head than most men could do on paper. He found this out because he mentioned, casually, the price of corn coming out of Nashville, and before he finished the sentence, she had already calculated what it meant for a family trying to put up provisions for winter. She found out he noticed her noticing things. Most men didn't notice that. They walked for 20 minutes. When they reached the roadhouse, she stopped at the gate and turned to face him. "Mr. Voss," she said, "whatever Samuel asked you to do—" She stopped, started again. "He worried too much about me. He always did. You don't have to carry that." Elias looked at her. The late morning sun was behind her, turning the loose edges of her hair warm at the borders. She was holding the gatepost the way a person holds on to something when they are bracing to hear something hard. And she was giving him permission to leave. She was doing it with such gentle, practiced ease, the ease of a woman who has been doing it her whole life, that it landed in his chest like a fist. "I'll call on you Thursday," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Thursday. I have business in Franklin. I'll come by the roadhouse." Ruth stared at him. "Why?" "Because I said I would." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Miss Adler." He rode out before she could find a reason to talk him out of it. He came on Thursday. He came alone, without hands or riders, and he tied his horse at the post and walked into the roadhouse and found Ruth behind the counter, her sleeves pushed to her elbows, her hair pinned up, flour on her forearm from the bread she had been making. She looked up when he came through the door. Something crossed her face that she covered quickly, something between relief and terror. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Miss Adler?" He set his hat on the counter. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" Constance Adler appeared from the kitchen before Ruth could answer. She was a tall woman, angular, with sharp eyes that moved over Elias the way eyes move over a piece of property when they are calculating its worth. "Mr. Voss," she said, and her voice carried the particular warmth of a woman addressing someone whose land she has considered. "What a surprise! We don't often get distinguished visitors to our little establishment." "I'm here to see Miss Ruth," Elias said. A beat of silence. Constance's eyes moved to Ruth. The look she gave her niece was brief and surgical. "Of course," Constance said. The warmth didn't reach her eyes. "Ruth, see to your guest." They sat at a corner table. Ruth folded her hands on the rough wood and waited with the patience of a woman who has learned that waiting is a form of armor. "I'll say it plain," Elias said. "I prefer plain," she said. "Samuel asked me to marry you." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Ruth sat very still. Her hands didn't move. Her face went through several things at once. Shock, confusion, a flash of something that looked almost like grief, as if Samuel's love for her had reached her from somewhere past the grave, and she didn't know whether to hold on to it or let it go. "He had no right," she said finally. Her voice was level. "He had no right to ask that of you." "He had every right. He saved my life." "That doesn't mean you owe me. I made him a promise, Miss Adler. You can keep your conscience clear and put me on a horse to Nashville," she said. "You don't need to marry me to honor a promise." Elias leaned forward. "Samuel didn't ask me to put you on a horse to Nashville. He asked me to take care of you. There's a difference." Ruth pressed her lips together. She looked at the table. Then she looked at him, and the look she gave him was so direct and so unguarded that Elias held still under it, the way you hold still when something is measuring you and you want it to get an honest reading. "Look at me," she said quietly. He was looking at her. He had not stopped. "I mean, really look," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly at the edge. "I am a 33-year-old woman who sleeps above a stable yard and hasn't had a wage in 3 years. My father's gone. My mother is gone. Half this county looks at me and sees something they don't have a word for and aren't interested in learning." She stopped, steadied herself. "Men like you don't. I am not the kind of woman that men like you—" She stopped again. "Are you done?" Elias said. Her eyes came up. "Here's what I'm proposing," he said. "A legal marriage. My name, my house, my protection. You want to leave after a year? I'll make sure you've got land in your own name and enough to keep you the rest of your life. But while you're there, while you carry my name, nobody treats you the way this family treats you. Not your aunt, not her daughter, not any man in this county." He paused. "Nobody." Ruth stared at him across the table. Her eyes were bright and her hands were not quite still. "Why?" she said. The word came out barely above a whisper. "Because Samuel asked me to," he said. "And because I keep my promises." You could honor Samuel without... This is not a small thing you're offering.
No, Elias agreed. It ain't.
It changes your life. Most things worth doing do. She looked at him for a long moment. The roadhouse moved around them, boots on the floor, voices at other tables, Constance somewhere in the kitchen pretending not to listen. Can I think on it? Ruth asked. Take whatever time you need, Elias said. She nodded slowly. Then, quietly, she said, Mr. Voss, why didn't Samuel just... Why you? Why not someone closer? Someone she could... Someone who... He said you were the best person he knew, Elias said, and that the only person in the world he trusted completely was me. He held her gaze. I reckon that's his answer. Ruth pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. Then she lowered her hand and folded it back into the other one, and she sat up straighter in her chair, and Elias watched something shift in her. Small, almost invisible, but real. I'll send word by Friday, she said. He rose. He picked up his hat. He looked at her one more time from across the table. This woman who talked about herself like she was a footnote and sat at the end of her own cousin's funeral pew and had worked 14 years without a wage and was sitting here now in a rough wood roadhouse in Franklin, Tennessee, offering him an honest answer instead of the easy one. Miss Adler, he said. Yes? Samuel was right about you. He put his hat on and walked out through the front door. Ruth sat at that table for a long time after his horse was gone from the post. Her hands were still not quite steady, and in her chest, in a place she had taught herself not to listen to, something that had been very quiet for a very long time was beginning, slowly and dangerously, to stir. She sent word on Thursday, a day early, a single sentence written in careful, even script on a piece of brown paper. I will do it. R. Adler. Elias read it in his front room at the Voss property, standing at the table with the afternoon coming in through the open door. Harris Cole, his second, sat in the corner chair, watching him with the specific patience of a man who has worked beside someone long enough to read them by the set of their shoulders. Good news or bad? Harris asked. Elias folded the paper once, set it on the table. Both, he said. Probably. Harris looked at the folded paper, looked at Elias. A slow smile worked its way across his weathered face. Well then, Harris said, reckon we better get the house in order. Elias said nothing. He stood there with his hands still on the folded paper, thinking about a woman at the end of a funeral pew who had practiced releasing people her whole life. He thought about what Samuel had said, standing in that field with his hat pushed back and the Tennessee sky white and hot above them. She never asks for help. You'll have to offer it. He picked up the paper. He put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest. She was coming on Saturday. And Elias Voss, who had not been unsure of a thing he'd decided in 15 years, stood in his own front room and understood that he had stepped off the edge of something he could not see the bottom of. He was not afraid, but he was paying attention. For the first time in a very long time, he was paying close, careful, complete attention. And that alone told him everything he needed to know. She arrived on a Saturday morning with 2 bags and an apology already forming on her lips. Elias saw her from the porch. She came up the road in the back of a neighbor's wagon, sitting straight, her bags on her lap, her face composed the way a face gets composed when a person has spent the whole ride telling themselves not to be afraid. The wagon stopped at the gate. She climbed down before the driver could offer a hand. She thanked him twice. She stood at the gate and looked at the house, and Elias watched her take one slow breath through her nose, before she picked up her bags and walked forward. He came down the steps to meet her. "Miss Adler," he said. "Mr. Voss?" She stopped a few feet away. "I want you to know I don't intend to be any trouble. I'll keep my space. I'll stay out of your way. I can cook and clean and help with whatever needs doing. I won't be a burden to you." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Don't say that again," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You ain't a burden. Don't call yourself one." He reached down and took the larger of her two bags before she could argue about it. "Come on, Margaret'll show you your room." Ruth stood there a half-second, her hand still curved from where the bag had been. Then she picked up the smaller one and followed him inside. Margaret was waiting in the front room. She was a Scottish woman, 55, with white hair pulled back so tight it looked like a statement of principle. She looked Ruth up and down once, not unkindly, but with the thoroughness of a woman who forms opinions quickly and rarely revises them. "Mrs. Voss," Margaret said. Ruth flinched slightly at the name, then steadied. "Please," she said. "Ruth is fine." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Your room is this way, Mrs. Voss." Ruth followed her down the hall. Elias stood in the front room and listened to their footsteps and thought about how the house sounded different already. He couldn't have explained it. He didn't try. The wedding had been 4 days earlier. A judge in Nashville, a Tuesday morning, Harris Cole as one witness and Margaret as the other. Ruth had worn a dark blue dress that she'd pressed the night before in the roadhouse kitchen after everyone else was asleep. Elias had noticed. He noticed the way she'd smoothed the front of it when she walked into the judge's office, a small, self-conscious gesture that she caught herself doing and stopped. The judge read the words. Ruth said yes, with a voice that didn't waver, which Elias suspected cost her something. He said yes the way he said everything, without decoration. When the judge said they could go, Elias offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked out into the July heat as husband and wife, and neither of them spoke for the first full minute, and the silence between them was the loudest thing on the street. In the wagon on the way back, she had finally said, "Thank you." He'd looked at her sideways. "For what?" "For doing this. For keeping your word to Samuel." She paused. "Most men wouldn't have." "I ain't most men," he said. She looked at her hands. "No," she said quietly. "I reckon you're not." He hadn't known what to say to that, so he'd said nothing, and she hadn't filled the silence with chatter the way he'd half expected, and that had surprised him more than anything else she'd done so far. Now she was in his house, in the room at the end of the hall, and Elias stood in his front room and picked up the nearest thing at hand, a ledger he'd already read twice, and stared at it without reading a word. Harris appeared in the doorway. "She settle in all right?" he asked. "Seems so." Harris leaned against the frame. He was a lean man, 40, with a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and a way of seeing things he kept mostly to himself. He and Elias had ridden together since before the war. He was the closest thing Elias had to a friend, which, in Elias's world, was not a small thing. "You ate yet?" Harris asked. "No." "Might want to," Harris said. "Margaret made biscuits." Elias set the ledger down. "Harris." "Yeah?" "Don't make this into something." Harris straightened up, his face entirely innocent. "Don't know what you mean, boss." He disappeared before Elias could respond. The first week was careful. They moved around each other with the particular courtesy of two people who understand they are in close quarters and have not yet established the rules. Elias left early. He came back at sundown. Ruth was usually in the kitchen when he returned, helping Margaret with supper. the two of them moving around each other in the practiced way of women who have negotiated a kitchen before. They ate together, Elias and Ruth, at the long table in the front room, with the evening coming in through the open windows and the sound of the land outside settling into dark. The food was good. Ruth ate carefully, small, neat portions, and Elias noticed it the same way he noticed everything, without comment, but completely. On the third night, Ruth said, "You don't have to eat with me if you'd rather not." Elias looked up from his plate. "What?" "I mean, I understand this is your home, your routine. You don't need to accommodate me at your own table." He set his fork down. "Ruth." She met his eyes. "This is your table too," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate. But something in her shoulders changed, just slightly, just enough. She stopped offering him reasons to treat her as less than she was, at least at supper. The first crack in the careful surface came on a Wednesday. Elias had ridden to town for supplies and come back to find Constance Adler's wagon in the yard. He heard the voices before he reached the door. "Expected better judgment from you, Ruth. Whatever you thought you were doing." "I got married, Aunt Constance." "You got yourself taken advantage of is what you did. A man like that doesn't marry a woman like you out of kindness. There's something behind it, and when it comes to light, you'll have nothing. No family, no—" "I have a husband." "You have a temporary arrangement with a man who made a foolish promise to a dead boy, and when he comes to his senses, that's enough." Elias came through the front door. Constance turned. She adjusted. The critical edge on her face smoothed itself into something that was not quite warmth, but was performing its general direction. "Mr. Voss," she said. "I heard what you were just," Elias said. The room went quiet. Constance's mouth thinned. "I came to see my niece," she said. "Your niece is my wife," Elias said. "And what you just said to her won't be said again. Not in this house, not anywhere I can hear it. We clear?" Constance drew herself up. "I don't think you understand the nature of—" "We clear?" Elias said again. His voice had not risen. It hadn't needed to. A long pause. Constance looked at Ruth. Ruth was standing very still beside the table, her hands folded, her face carefully neutral. But her eyes were bright. "Clear," Constance said finally. The word came out like something she'd had to reach for. "Good." Elias held the door. "Safe ride home, Mrs. Adler." Constance left without another word. Dorothy, who had been standing near the window this whole time with her mouth slightly open, scurried after her. The door closed. The house was quiet. Ruth stood in the middle of the room. Her shoulders were shaking, just slightly, just at the edges. Not from crying. From the effort of not doing something that would have cost her more than she wanted to spend. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." "She's going to be worse now when she comes back." "Then she'll have the same conversation with me again," Elias said. "And the one after that, as many times as it takes." Ruth looked at him. Something moved across her face. Something she covered quickly, but not quickly enough. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet. "Truly, why does any of this matter to you?" Elias crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her. "Because Samuel mattered to me," he said. "And you mattered to Samuel. That makes you matter. That's simple math, Ruth." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, pressed her lips together, and walked back toward the kitchen. At the door she paused. She didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said. Not the careful, obligated thank you from the wagon. Something rawer than that. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just eat your supper." She laughed. It was small and surprised, and it was gone almost before it arrived. But it was real. The realest sound he had heard in this house in years. He stood there after she was gone and thought that Samuel, wherever he was probably feeling very satisfied with himself. The second week, Ruth started reading in the evenings. Elias came in from the south field one evening to find her at the table with a book propped open and a candle burning and her reading glasses on, which she hadn't worn in front of him before. She looked up when he came in. Then she looked back down at the book without making a production of it, and something about that, the easy lack of performance, stopped him in the doorway for a second. "Margaret left supper in the pot," she said, not looking up. He washed at the basin. He served himself. He sat at the other end of the table. He ate. She read. And it was the most settled Elias Voss had felt inside his own house in 4 years. He started noticing small things after that. The way she tucked her hair back when she was concentrating. A quick automatic gesture with 2 fingers behind her left ear. The way she held her coffee cup with both hands wrapped around it in the mornings, like it was giving her something she needed. The way she talked to Margaret, not to her, not past her, but with her, with the same quiet respect she gave to everyone, regardless of what they could offer her in return. He noticed that she was teaching herself to take up space. It was incremental, slow, some days barely visible, but he noticed. A book left on the bench by the window. Her shawl over the chair by the fire. One morning he came in and she had rearranged the jars on the kitchen shelf into an order that made more sense and hadn't asked permission to do it. He noticed that too. He didn't say anything. He didn't move the jars back. On a Friday evening, Harris stayed for supper. Ruth cooked a venison stew with dried herbs that filled the house with something warm and layered. Harris ate 2 full bowls and looked at Elias over the third with an expression that was doing a great deal of work trying to be neutral. "Mrs. Voss," Harris said, "that is the finest thing I've eaten since before the war." "It's just stew," Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am. Best stew in Tennessee." Ruth smiled at him. Not the careful smile, not the deflecting one. A real one, warm and direct. And Harris blinked at it slightly like a man who hadn't expected that particular light to be pointed at him. After Harris left, Ruth was washing the bowls and Elias was at the table with the ledger he actually intended to read this time when she said without turning around, "He's kind." "Harris? Don't let him hear you say it. He's got a reputation to protect." She laughed again, that quick surprise sound. And then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." She turned around, dried her hands on her apron, looked at him. "Your wife," she said carefully. "Samuel told me a little. I'm not asking to pry, but I'm living in her house and I don't even know her name." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said. Ruth nodded. She waited. "She died 4 years ago. The baby, too." He kept his eyes on the ledger. Fever took them both. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. And she said it the way very few people said it, without reaching for something to fill the space after it. She just let it sit there, honest and plain. "It was a long time ago," Elias said. "Some things stay long no matter how long they've been," she said quietly. He looked up at her then. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything. Straight, without flinching, like she had decided the truth was better than the comfortable version of it. "Yeah," he said. "Reckon so." She turned back to the washing, and Elias stared at the ledger and did not read a single word of it. 3 weeks in, Dorothy Adler rode out to the property alone. Elias was in the barn when he heard the hoofbeats. He came out to find Dorothy dismounting at the gate, her blonde hair pinned up, her expression arranged into a version of friendliness that didn't reach her eyes. Ruth was on the porch.
"Well," Dorothy called out, "this is something, ain't it?"
She came through the gate and looked up at Ruth the way a person looks at something they resent not having thought of first.
"Mama sends her regards."
"I doubt that," Ruth said pleasantly. Dorothy's smile tightened.
"I came to see how you were settling in. Friendly call."
"Come up then," Ruth said. Elias stayed where he was, just inside the barn door. He could hear them on the porch. He told himself he was checking the harness. He was not checking the harness.
"You look different," Dorothy said.
"Do I?"
"More—"
Dorothy paused.
"settled. It's strange."
"Is it?"
"Ruth," Dorothy's voice dropped, conspiratorial. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me."
"I usually am," Ruth said.
"Does he actually— I mean, is it a real—" She stopped. Tried again. "He doesn't actually treat you like a wife, does he?" Silence. "I mean," Dorothy pressed, "a man like that, with a woman. You know what I mean. There's no— This is an arrangement, a charity, right? Mama said that's what it is. A man keeping a promise to a dead friend. It ain't real."
Elias went very still inside the barn. Ruth was quiet for a long moment.
"Dorothy,"
she said finally, and her voice was something Elias hadn't heard from her before. Not hard, not loud, but absolutely certain.
"I need you to hear what I'm about to say."
"I'm listening."
"This is my home. This man is my husband. And whatever you and your mother have decided to call this, the two of you can keep that conversation for your own kitchen table."
A pause. "And I think you ought to go now." A long silence.
"Well,"
Dorothy said,
"I was only—"
"Goodbye, Dorothy." Hoofbeats, moments later, retreating fast. Elias came out of the barn. Ruth was standing at the edge of the porch, her hands on the rail, her back to the yard. He crossed toward her. She heard his steps and turned. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. "You heard that," she said. "Some of it." She nodded. She looked down at her hands on the rail.
"Is she right?"
she asked. And the steadiness in her voice when she said it cost something. He could hear the cost of it.
Is it just a promise? Is that all it is?"
Elias came up the porch steps. He stopped the cider at the rail. "Ruth," he said. She looked at him. "I have kept a great many promises in my life," he said. "Most of them I kept because I gave my word, and that was enough. I didn't keep them because I wanted to. I kept them because I had to." He held her gaze. "This one is different." She was very still. "When I saw you at Samuel's funeral," he said, "sitting at the end of that pew by yourself while your whole family arranged themselves up front, I knew something. I didn't have the word for it yet, but I knew."
"Knew what?"
she said, barely a sound. "That Samuel wasn't wrong about you," he said, "and that whatever this started as, it ain't just a promise anymore." Ruth looked at him for a long time, the kind of long that changes the size of the space between two people.
"You should have told me that before I sent Dorothy away," she said. "I might have done it sooner."
He looked at her, and then, slowly, like sunlight moving, she smiled. It was small. It was real. And it went straight through him like the first honest thing in a long time. He turned back toward the yard before she could see what was on his face. "Supper'll be soon," he said.
"It will,"
she agreed. He went back to the barn. He stood inside it for a full 2 minutes doing nothing. Harris was sitting on a hay bale in the corner, watching him with the expression of a man who is absolutely, completely not going to say anything. Not one word, Elias said. Wasn't going to say a thing, Harris said, and looked serenely at the ceiling. Elias picked up the nearest tool, went back to work. But his hands, for the first time in 4 years, were not entirely steady. And that told him something he was not yet ready to say out loud, but that was true all the same. Something was changing in this house. Something slow and quiet and irreversible. And Elias Voss, who had survived war and loss and a decade of building an empire on the frontier, understood with sudden clarity that whatever was coming next was going to require more courage than any of it. Because he had stopped keeping this promise for Samuel. He just hadn't told Ruth yet. The letter arrived on a Monday. Margaret brought it in with the breakfast things, set it beside Elias's coffee without a word, and left the room with the careful efficiency of a woman who has learned when not to be present. Elias looked at it. The handwriting on the outside was neat and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that announces itself as educated before you've read a single word. He turned it over. The seal on the back was one he recognized. Thomas Whitmore, Land Commissioner, Nashville. He opened it. He read it twice. Then he set it face down on the table and finished his coffee. Ruth came in from the back, her sleeves already rolled, her hair pinned, carrying the small basket she used when she went out to check on the kitchen garden before the heat got serious. She saw his face and stopped. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. He had not heard her come in. That alone told him something about how far gone his concentration was. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him the way she always looked at hard things, straight, without blinking, ready to hear it. "There's a man named Thomas Whitmore," Elias said. "Land Commissioner out of Nashville. He's been trying to acquire the southeastern quarter of my property for 2 years. I've told him no, twice." "And now?" Ruth said. "Now he's found a different angle." Elias turned the letter over and slid it across to her. She read it. He watched her face while she read, watched the small, careful line form between her brows, watched her lips press together when she reached the second paragraph. She set the letter down. "He's claiming the marriage is fraudulent," she said. "That you married me to consolidate land claims before the county assessment." "That's what he's claiming." "Is that... Can he do that? Can he take the land on that basis?" "He can try," Elias said. "If he gets a hearing before the right judge, he can make enough noise to tie up the eastern quarter in dispute for 2 or 3 years. Cost me half the timber contracts in that time." Ruth was quiet. Then she said, "This is because of me." "This is because of Whitmore," Elias said. "Don't do that." "Elias." "Ruth." His voice was level. "Whitmore was looking for a lever. If it wasn't the marriage, it'd be something else. This ain't your fault." She looked at him. He could see her wanting to argue it and deciding against it, and that restraint was its own kind of progress from the woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago with an apology already on her lips. "What do we do?" she said. "We go to Nashville," Elias said. "Friday. Together. There's a gathering at the Whitmore property that evening. He hosts the county men every summer. Every landowner, every commissioner, every judge who matters will be in that room." He paused. "We walk in together. We let them see us. We let them make their calculations." Ruth looked down at the letter, then back at him. "You want to put me in a room full of men who will look at me the way Dorothy looks at me? And you want that to help?" "I want to put you in a room full of men who respect power," Elias said, "and let them see whose side of the room you're standing on." A silence. "I don't have anything to wear to something like that," she said. Not with self-pity, with the plain practicality of a woman solving a problem. "Margaret'll take care of it," Elias said. Ruth nodded once. She picked up the letter, folded it, set it back down. "All right," she said, and then, quietly, "I won't let them use me as a lever against you." "I know," he said. "I mean it, Elias. If it comes to it, if me being here is what's costing you—" "Ruth." He said her name with a finality that stopped her. "You are not going anywhere. Are we clear?" She held his gaze. Her chin came up just slightly. "Clear," she said. But her hands on the table were not entirely still. Margaret, when told, said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Leave it to me," in a tone that suggested Thomas Whitmore had already lost something and simply didn't know it yet. Harris, when told, leaned back in his chair and said, "Whitmore is going to regret this." "He already does," Elias said. "He just don't know it yet." "You want me to ride to Nashville ahead of you? Talk to some people?" "Yeah, but Harris." I know. Quiet. I mean it. Nothing that leaves a mark." Harris put on his hat. "Never does, boss," he said, and rode out. The days between Monday and Friday move the way days move when something is coming. Too slow in the middle and too fast at the edges. Ruth was quieter than usual. Not frightened quiet. Thinking quiet. Elias had learned the difference. She read more. She asked him questions in the evenings about the land, the boundaries, the timber rights, the terms of the county assessment, and he answered them, and she listened with the focused attention of someone filing things away for use. On Wednesday evening, he came in late to find her at the table with a piece of paper and a quill, writing. She didn't stop when he came in. He washed up. He sat across from her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing down everything I know about the property," she said without looking up. "Dates, boundaries, what you told me about the timber contracts. If someone asks me something in that room Friday, I don't want to stare at them blank." He looked at her across the table. "Ruth," he said. She looked up. "Samuel said you were the smartest person in that family," he said. She blinked. "He said that?" "He said it like it was plain fact, like saying the sky was up." She looked back down at her paper, but her mouth did something small and involuntary that she didn't catch in time. "He was biased," she said. "He wasn't wrong," Elias said. She kept writing, but her hand moved a little more steadily after that. Friday arrived. They rode to Nashville in the wagon, Margaret and Harris following in a second rig. Ruth sat beside Elias on the bench, her back straight, her hands folded, wearing a dress that Margaret had produced from some combination of fabric and will that Elias did not entirely understand. It was deep blue, clean-lined, and it fit Ruth's body honestly, not pretending she was something other than what she was, but presenting what she was with a kind of quiet authority. When she had come out of the house that evening, Elias had stopped on the porch steps. She had looked at him. "Is it all right?" He had looked at her for a moment. "You look like someone they're going to remember," he said. She had smoothed the front of the dress once, that small, self-conscious gesture he'd seen before, and then she'd stopped doing it and walked to the wagon. They arrived at the Whitmore property as the sun was dropping. The yard was already full of horses and rigs. Men in good coats moved through the gathering with the ease of people who consider themselves the natural occupants of any room they enter. Women circled the edges in the practiced way of women who understand that their job at events like this is to be decorative and to remember everything. Elias helped Ruth down from the wagon. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked in together. The first thing Elias noticed was how quickly the room recalibrated. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. Eyes moved. Assessments were made. He had been walking into rooms like this for 15 years, and he knew exactly what was happening. The same thing that happened every time he entered any room. People were deciding what he meant. The difference was that tonight they were also deciding what she meant. A man named Carter Hale, broad-faced and prosperous, came toward them with his hand out. He owned the next largest parcel east of the Voss property and had been friendly with Elias in the calculated way of men who believe proximity to power is a form of power. "Elias," Hale said. Then his eyes moved to Ruth. He paused one beat too long. "Carter," Elias said. "My wife, Ruth." Hale extended his hand to her. "Ma'am, pleasure." "Mr. Hale," Ruth said, "I believe your eastern fence line runs along the creek that feeds our lower pasture. Elias mentioned you've been discussing water rights." Hale blinked. Yes, that's right." "I hope you can find an arrangement," she said pleasantly. "That pasture is some of the best land on the property. It'd be a shame for either party to lose use of the water." Hale looked at her, then at Elias, then back at her with the expression of a man who has been surprised and is not sure how he feels about it. "Indeed," he said. "Indeed, ma'am." They moved on. Harris materialized at Elias's shoulder for a moment, long enough to murmur, "Whitmore's near the fireplace, east side. Judge Alderman is with him." "I see them," Elias said. "Alderman's the one who'd hear the land dispute if it comes to filing," Harris said. "I know who he is." "Right." Harris disappeared. Ruth said quietly, near his ear, "Which one is Whitmore?" "Tall man, gray coat. He's going to come to us before we get to him." "How do you know?" "Because he's been watching us since we walked in," Elias said. "And men like Whitmore need to feel like they're directing the conversation." She absorbed that. "And Judge Alderman?" "Shorter man beside him, red waistcoat. He's fair, but he likes to be courted." "Courted how?" "Like he's the smartest man in the room." Ruth was quiet for a moment.
"I can do that," she said.
He looked at her sideways. "I know," he said. Whitmore came to them within 10 minutes. He was exactly as Elias had predicted. Smooth, smiling, moving toward them with the confidence of a man who had decided this encounter would go the way he'd planned it. "Elias," he said warmly. "Good to see you." His eyes moved to Ruth with a particular kind of pause that men use when they are deciding how to categorize something unexpected. "And this must be Mrs. Voss." "Thomas," Elias said. "My wife, Ruth." Whitmore took her hand. "Charmed man. We've heard wonderful things." "Have you?" Ruth said. It was not quite a question. Her tone was warm and clear and gave nothing away. "Indeed, Franklin is a small world," he smiled. The smile didn't touch his eyes. "I do hope you're finding the Voss property to your liking. It's quite a piece of land." "It is," Ruth said. 4,200 acres as of the last county survey. The eastern timber alone accounts for about a third of the assessed value." She smiled at him. "I understand you've had some interest in the southeastern quarter." Whitmore's smile held, but something behind it moved. "I've had some conversations, yes. Just exploratory." "Of course," Ruth said pleasantly. "It's natural to want what's already spoken for. The land is exceptional." A beat of silence. "Your wife is very informed," Whitmore said to Elias. "She is," Elias said. Whitmore looked at Ruth. The smile had become something more careful. "You know, Mrs. Voss, there are some who have questions about the circumstances of your marriage." "Given the timing of the county assessment, I'd imagine there are," Ruth said, and her voice was so even, it was almost musical. "People always have questions about things they can't explain. A man like my husband, choosing a woman like me." She held Whitmore's gaze. "But the only people whose questions matter are the ones with a legal standing to ask them. And as far as I know, curiosity isn't a land claim." The silence that followed had weight to it. Behind Whitmore, Judge Alderman had drifted closer. Whether by accident or intention, he had heard most of that exchange. He was looking at Ruth with an expression that was not what Whitmore would have wanted him to be wearing. "Well said, ma'am," the judge said, stepping forward. "Well said." Whitmore turned, adjusted. "Judge Alderman, you know Elias Voss, of course." "Of course." Alderman shook Elias's hand, and then turned immediately back to Ruth. "Mrs. Voss, Alderman, I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Ruth said, "but I've heard your name spoken well, Your Honor. Elias has great respect for the way you've handled the creek boundary cases this term." Alderman's chest expanded approximately 1 inch. "Is that so?" "The principle of prior use over proximity," she said. "It's the only equitable standard in a county where the land was settled in sections. Anyone who understands frontier property law can see that." Alderman looked at her with the delighted expression of a man who has just discovered that someone else has read the same books he has. "Indeed," he said. "Indeed, Mrs. Voss. You have a fine grasp of the matter." Whitmore stood slightly to the left of this conversation, with the expression of a man watching a plan dismantle itself in real time. Later, much later, after the fire in the yard had burned low, and the gathering had thinned to the men who were staying for whiskey and the women who were waiting for their husbands, Elias found Ruth near the edge of the yard. She was standing alone for a moment, her hands at her sides, looking out toward the road. He came up beside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She paused. "No." She turned to face him. "Dorothy is here." He hadn't seen that. "Where?" "She came with the Harmon family. She's been watching me all evening." Ruth's jaw was set. "She said something to me, earlier, when you were talking to Hale." "What did she say?" Ruth looked at him. In the low light, her expression was something he hadn't seen before. Not the careful neutrality, not the practiced composure. Something underneath all of that. Something older. "She said Constance has been talking to Whitmore," Ruth said. That Constance told him the marriage was arranged to protect the land. That I agreed to it because I had nowhere else to go and no real choice." She stopped. "She said Constance is prepared to say so in front of the judge if it comes to a hearing." Elias went still. "She said," Ruth continued, and her voice was steady in the way that costs everything to keep steady, "that her mother has a letter, something Samuel wrote before he left. She said it proves that you made the promise under duress, that Samuel manipulated you." She pressed her lips together. "That I'm just the instrument of it." The silence between them was different now, harder. "Ruth," Elias said. "If she does it," Ruth said, "if Constance testifies against us, against you, the land dispute gets traction. Whitmore gets his hearing, and it'll be my family that gave him the lever." Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with something fiercer than tears. "My own blood, Elias, my own—" She stopped. He watched her fight it, watched her take a breath and hold it, and come back to herself from whatever edge she'd been standing on. "We should go," she said. "I don't want to be in the same yard as Dorothy anymore tonight." He touched her arm, just his hand on her arm. She went still at the contact. "Listen to me," he said. She looked at him. "Your aunt doesn't have a letter that changes anything," he said, "because there's nothing to change. Samuel asked me a favor. I agreed to it. That's not manipulation. That's friendship." He held her gaze. "And if Constance wants to stand in front of a judge and explain why she knows so much about a promise made between two soldiers in a field before a battle, she's welcome to try." Ruth stared at him. "You're not worried." "I'm angry," he said. "That's different." She held his gaze for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "Right now?" He offered her his arm. "Take my wife home." She looked at his arm. She looked at him. Something moved across her face, quick and complicated and real. She took his arm. They walked through the yard toward the wagon. Dorothy was standing near the gate with the Harmon women, and when she saw them coming, she straightened up and opened her mouth, and Elias looked at her exactly once. Just once. With the steady, unhurried certainty of a man who has ended harder conversations than this one. Dorothy closed her mouth. They went through the gate. In the wagon, Ruth sat beside him in the dark, the road ahead lit thin by the moon, the night sounds of summer Tennessee all around them. She didn't speak for a long time. He didn't push. Then she said, "Elias." "Yeah?" "When you came into that roadhouse in Franklin the first time," she said slowly, "and you asked to talk to me, did you know then what you were going to feel?" He kept his eyes on the road. "No." "When did you know?" He thought about the funeral pew. He thought about her on the porch steps in the white morning glare with no one stopping to speak to her. He thought about the note on brown paper, a day early, the careful, even script. "Samuel's funeral," he said, "when I saw where they'd seated you." She was quiet. "You were sitting at the end of the row," he said. "Last seat. Like they'd put you there so they could forget you were in the room." That's when you knew?" "I knew I wasn't walking away," he said. "I didn't have a name for the rest of it yet." Ruth looked out at the dark road. He heard her exhale, slow and deliberate. "My aunt told me something when I was 17, she said. She said some women are roses and some women are weeds. She said the kindest thing you can do for a weed is let it know what it is early, before it wastes time trying to bloom." Elias said nothing. He let her finish. "I believed her for a long time," Ruth said. "Most of my life, if I'm honest." She paused. "I'm not sure I believe her anymore." He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. "You ain't a weed, Ruth," he said. She held his gaze in the dark. "No," she said, and her voice was different, steadier, like something that had been uncertain for 33 years had finally decided to stand on solid ground. "I don't think I am." He turned back to the road. His jaw was tight. His hands on the reins were steady. But inside his chest, something was happening that he was done pretending wasn't there. Something that had started the moment she'd sent that note a day early, and had been growing every morning he woke up in his own house and heard her moving around in it, making it into something it had never been before. He had promised Samuel he would protect her. He had kept that promise. But somewhere on the road between that promise and this wagon, in the dark, with her sitting beside him and her voice saying, "I don't think I am," like it was the first true thing she'd ever allowed herself. Somewhere in there, protection had become something else entirely. Something Elias Voss had not felt since before Clara died, and had not expected to feel again. He didn't say it, not yet, but it was there, settled and certain, the way only real things settle. And Ruth Adler Voss, riding home beside him in the Tennessee summer dark, was quiet in the way a woman is quiet when she is finally, carefully, terrifyingly beginning to believe in something she has spent her whole life being told she was not allowed to have. The letter from Constance arrived on a Tuesday, 4 days after the Whitmore gathering. Margaret brought it in without comment, the way Margaret brought everything, with the expression of a woman who has already formed her opinion and is keeping it to herself out of professionalism rather than uncertainty. Ruth was at the table with her coffee and a borrowed copy of a land registry document Elias had left out for her. She looked at the handwriting on the outside
and set her coffee down very carefully. She opened it. She read it standing up, which was how she read things she expected to be hard. It was worse than she expected. Constance had written 2 pages in her neat schoolroom script. The first page was an account of Ruth's childhood, framed, of course, as charity. The roof she had been given, the food, the years of patience extended to a girl of mixed blood who had no other options and who should, by rights, have been grateful every day of her life. The second page was the part that made Ruth's hands go still. Constance was prepared to present herself to Judge Alderman. She had, she wrote, a duty to the truth. She had a duty to the county, to the good families who relied on the Land Commission to operate without manipulation. And she had, she wrote, a letter from Samuel, written before he rode south. A letter in which Samuel had described, in his own words, what he intended to ask of Elias Voss, what he intended to arrange for his cousin Ruth, who, Samuel had written, would never arrange anything for herself. Constance called it evidence of coercion. She called it proof that the marriage was constructed, not chosen. At the bottom of the second page, in a postscript that was somehow worse than everything above it, Constance had written, "I do this for your own good, Ruth. A woman in your position should not be made to carry a burden that was never meant to be hers. Come home. We will say no more about it." Ruth folded the letter. She set it on the table. She sat down. She sat there for a long time. When Elias came in from the north field, his boots loud on the floorboards, he stopped the moment he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, the way she had learned to watch his face. Not the surface of it, but the small, precise changes underneath. The tightening at the corner of his jaw. The stillness that came into his shoulders when he reached the second page. The absolute, complete absence of movement when he finished. He folded the letter. "She's going to go to Alderman," Ruth said. "Yeah, she's going to tell him Samuel manipulated you, that I'm the product of a coerced arrangement." She kept her voice level. "And she has something in Samuel's handwriting that she's calling proof." "I heard what it says," Elias said. "Elias," she stood up. "She's my aunt. If she walks into that courthouse and says those things under oath, it doesn't matter what we say after. The story will already be told. People will already have decided." "People have been deciding things about me for 15 years, Elias said. "I'm still here." "This is different. This isn't about you." She pressed her fingers to the table. "This is about the land, about everything you built, and it's my family handing the lever to your enemy." Her voice finally cracked at the edge. Just the edge. "I will not be the reason Thomas Whitmore takes what's yours." Elias set the letter down. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin to look at him. "Listen to me," he said. "That letter Samuel wrote. It doesn't say what Constance says it says." Ruth frowned. "How do you know? You haven't seen it." "Because I know what Samuel would have written," he said. "I knew that man for 12 years. He wasn't careless with words. He wasn't careless with anything." He held her gaze. "Whatever's in that letter, it's the truth. And the truth of what Samuel asked me and why I agreed to it is not coercion. It's friendship. And no judge in this county who understands frontier life is going to look at 2 soldiers and call what passes between them manipulation." "You sound certain," she said. "I am." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, something that had been close to the surface for weeks and kept choosing not to break through.
Because I would have married you without the promise, he said. The room went very quiet. Ruth stared at him.
You don't know that.
We didn't. I know it, he said. I knew it about 2 weeks after you got here. I just wasn't ready to say it yet. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again.
Elias,
I'm going to Nashville today, he said. I'm going to talk to Alderman before Constance does. Harris will ride with me. He picked up his hat from the chair. You stay here. Margaret's here. Don't let anyone through the gate except Harris's boy if he comes with a message. She grabbed his arm. He stopped.
You can't just say something like that and then put your hat on, she said.
He looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. And for a moment, the urgency in him shifted. Not disappeared, but moved aside enough to make room for what was actually happening between them. I know, he said quietly. We'll talk when I get back. She held his arm a second longer. Then she let go. Be careful, she said. He touched the brim of his hat, and he walked out the door. Harris was waiting in the yard with the horses already saddled. He took one look at Elias coming off the porch and said nothing, which was the most useful thing Harris Cole ever did. They rode hard. Elias got to Nashville by early afternoon and went directly to Alderman's office above the courthouse. The clerk tried to tell him the judge was occupied. Elias walked past him. Alderman looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who has been interrupted and is deciding whether to be irritated about it. Then he saw who it was. His expression shifted into something more considered. Voss, he said. Judge? Elias sat down without being invited. He put his hat on his knee. I need 5 minutes. You need an appointment. I need 5 minutes, Elias said again. Same voice, same steadiness. Alderman looked at him for a moment. Then he set his pen down. 5 minutes. Elias told him everything. Not most of it. Everything. Samuel in the field before the battle. The promise. Ruth at the funeral pew. The wedding. What Whitmore was building. What Constance was preparing to bring to his door. Alderman listened with his hands folded on the desk and his face unreadable. When Elias finished, the judge was quiet for a long moment. You're telling me, Alderman said slowly, that you married this woman not for property, but for a dead man's last request. That's what I'm telling you. And you're asking me to weigh that against whatever the ant brings me. I'm asking you to give it the weight it deserves, Elias said, which is considerable, because Samuel Adler died in service to this country, and the last thing he asked of his closest friend was to look after the one person his family had spent 30 years mistreating. And now that family wants to use his memory to undo the only thing he ever arranged in his own interest. Alderman was quiet again. The woman, he said. Your wife. She was at the Whitmore gathering? She was. She spoke to me about prior use doctrine, Alderman said. There was something in his voice that was not quite a smile. Where'd she learn that? Books, Elias said. She reads everything she can find. Alderman nodded slowly. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. Tell Mrs. Adler, the aunt, that if she intends to bring a complaint to my office, she'll need to do it in writing, with a letter submitted as evidence for examination by both parties. He paused. That process takes approximately 60 days. 60 days. Long enough for the county assessment to be completed. Long enough for Whitmore's window to close. Appreciate it, Elias said. Don't thank me, Alderman said. I'm applying the standard process, nothing more. He picked up his pen again. Close the door on your way out, Voss. Elias closed the door. Harris was waiting in the street below. Elias came down the steps, and Harris read his face and let out a slow breath. "Well?" Harris said. 60 days, Elias said. Harris thought about that. Assessment's done in 40. I know. Harris nodded once. Then it's done. It's done, Elias agreed. They rode back. The sun was dropping by the time they reached the property, the summer evening thick and warm and smelling of the fields drying out after the afternoon. Elias handed his horse to Harris without a word and went inside. Margaret was in the kitchen. She looked up when he came through. "She's on the porch," she said. He went through to the front. Ruth was sitting on the porch bench with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the yard. She heard the door and turned. The look she gave him was the most unguarded one he had seen from her yet. All the armor down, just the question in her eyes, plain and direct. "Well," she said. 60 days before Constance can bring anything before Alderman. Assessment's done in 40. Ruth closed her eyes, just for a moment. Just long enough to let out the breath she'd been holding since morning. Then she opened them. "You went around her," she said. "I went before her," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "Elias." "Yeah?" "Sit down," she said. He sat beside her on the bench. She turned to face him, one knee pulled up, her back against the porch post. The last of the evening light was behind her. "You said something this morning," she said. "Before you left." "I know what I said." "I want to know if you meant it." Her voice was quiet, but it was not uncertain. "Not the part about the promise, or Samuel, or protecting me. The other part." He looked at her. "I meant it." She held his gaze. "How long?" He thought about it honestly. "A while," he said. "Longer than I let on." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should know something." "Go ahead." "When I sent that note," she said, "the one that said I would do it, I sent it a day early." He remembered. "I know." "You know why?" He waited. "Because I was afraid if I waited until Friday, I would talk myself out of it," she said. "And I realized on Thursday evening that I didn't want to talk myself out of it. Not because of the house or the land or getting away from Constance." She looked at him steadily. "Because of you." The porch was very still. "I had talked to you twice," she said, "at the funeral and at the roadhouse. And both times you looked at me like—" She stopped, started again. "Like I was worth looking at. Like what I said was worth hearing. Like I wasn't a footnote." She shook her head slightly. "I had never had a man look at me that way. I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't, entirely." "Ruth." "I'm not finished," she said. He went quiet. "I know what I look like," she said. "I know what people see when they see me. A woman who is too much in some ways and not enough in every way that's supposed to matter. A woman with the wrong blood and the wrong shape and the wrong history. I have been told my whole life that love is for other kinds of women, that belonging is for other kinds of women." Her voice was steady and fierce and real. "And I believed it for so long that I stopped checking if it was true." He said nothing. He was listening with everything he had. "I'm checking now," she said quietly. "And I think it might not be true. I think it might have been the biggest lie I ever let into my own head." She looked at him. "I think you might be why I finally checked." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. She went very still at the contact, but she didn't pull back. Her hand was warm and solid in his, and he held it with the deliberate, careful grip of a man who is holding something he intends to keep. "Ruth Adler," he said. She looked at him. "I have built everything I own with my own hands," he said. "I have never asked for anything I wasn't willing to work for. I have never wanted anything I wasn't willing to fight for. He paused. I am telling you plainly that I want this. You, whatever this is between us. Not because of Samuel and not because of a promise. Because you walked into my house and made it into a home without even trying. And I don't know how to go back to what it was before. Her eyes were bright. She did not blink. That is not a small thing to say, she told him. No, he agreed. It ain't. You understand what you're saying. I'm a careful man, he said. I don't say things I don't mean. You know that by now. She looked at their hands, then back at his face. And then, slowly, like something that had been deciding for a long time and had finally decided, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. He brought his free hand up to the back of her head. He held her there, steady and solid, the way he held everything that mattered to him. Without display, without drama, with the quiet, total certainty of a man who has made up his mind. They sat like that for a long time on the porch in the dying summer light. Then she said into his shoulder, Margaret knows. Margaret knows everything, he said. She knew before we did. Ruth laughed, that real, quick, surprised laugh that he had started to plan his days around without admitting it. She sat back and looked at him, and her face was open in a way that made her look both younger and more herself at the same time. What do we do about Constance? She asked. Constance is going to discover that 60 days is a long time, Elias said, and that filing a complaint in writing requires putting her name on something permanent. Women like Constance don't like permanent. You think she'll back down? I think she'll try one more thing first, he said. She always does. He was right. The next morning, Constance arrived at the property gate on foot, which meant she had left her wagon on the road and walked in deliberately, a choice that announced itself as righteousness. Margaret saw her coming from the kitchen window and said to no one in particular, Lord, give me patience. Then she went to wake Elias. Elias was already up. He met Constance in the yard. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the first time, assessing, calculating, her sharp eyes moving over him for leverage. She had not found any yet. That had not stopped her from looking. Mr. Voss, she said, I need to speak to my niece. My wife isn't available, Elias said. She is my family, Constance said. You do not have the authority to— I have every authority, Elias said. This is my property. Ruth is my wife. And you have spent the last 4 weeks attempting to use a dead man's letter to take apart her marriage and hand her enemies a weapon against her. He held Constance's gaze without blinking. You're going to tell me what family is? Constance's mouth thinned. You don't understand the situation. I understand it fine. Ruth is not equipped for a life like this, Constance said, and her voice carried the specific conviction of a woman who has believed something so long it has calcified into certainty. She never has been. She is not the kind of woman who thrives in circumstances like these. I am trying to protect her from humiliation. You're trying to protect yourself from irrelevance, Elias said. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Constance stared at him. Something moved in her face. Not guilt exactly, but the flicker of a thing that might have been guilt in a woman with more practice at it. Ruth, she said, is a woman who has spent her life being underestimated. I did not start that. Her father did when he left. The world did when it looked at her mother and decided what that meant. She stopped. You simply continued it, Elias said, because it was easier than stopping it. A long moment, Constance looked at the house, then back at Elias. And something in the rigid set of her shoulders moved, fractionally, like a door that had been closed too long and was finally coming off the frame.
Is she happy? Constance asked. And her voice was different, stripped of its armor. Just the question, plain and human. Elias looked at her. Ask her yourself, he said, if you can ask it the right way. He stepped aside. Constance stood in the yard for a moment. Then she walked to the porch. Ruth was in the doorway. She had heard everything. Her face was not angry. It was not forgiving either. It was simply open, present, and honest, the way Ruth's face always was when she had stopped performing. "Aunt Constance," she said. Constance looked at her niece. Really looked. The way she perhaps had not looked in 30 years. And whatever she saw in Ruth's face, the steadiness, the quiet strength, the absence of apology, made something shift behind her eyes. "You look different," Constance said. Her voice was very quiet. "I am different," Ruth said. "I've been different for a while. You just never looked long enough to see it." Constance was silent. Then she said, "I have the letter." "I know you do." "I won't use it," Constance said, and the words came out like something let go after being held too long. "I won't take it to Alderman. I won't give it to Whitmore." She looked at Ruth. "Samuel would have. He would not have wanted me to." Ruth nodded. Once. Slowly. "No," Ruth said. "He wouldn't." They stood there looking at each other, the aunt and the niece. 33 years of distance between them and something not quite resolved, but perhaps beginning to be honest about itself. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was the first honest silence they had ever shared. Constance touched the collar of her coat. "I'll see myself out," she said. She walked back through the yard. Elias watched her go. At the gate she paused. She did not turn around, but she stood there for a moment with her hand on the post and her back straight, and then she kept walking. Harris appeared at Elias's shoulder. "That went better than I expected," he said. "Most things do," Elias said, "when you tell the truth." He turned back to the house. Ruth was still in the doorway. Her expression was the complicated, layered thing of a person who has just watched something end that has been running for most of their life. Not happy, not sad. Something bigger than both. She looked at him. "She's not going to change," Ruth said. "Not really." "Probably not," he agreed. "But she's not going to fight us anymore." "No," he said. "She's not." Ruth leaned against the doorframe. She looked at the yard where her aunt's footprints were still pressed into the dust. Then she looked back at Elias with the direct, clear-eyed gaze that had stopped him cold the first time she turned it on him outside a Dorchester church, and had not lost any of its force since. "Elias," she said. "Yeah?" "I want to learn to ride," she said. "Properly. Not just in the wagon." He blinked. Of everything she might have said in this moment, he had not expected that. "All right," he said. "I want to know this land," she said. "All of it. Every acre. I want to know what you built and why and how." She straightened up from the doorframe. "I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to be something that just lives inside these walls and stays out of your way." She held his gaze. "I'm your wife, Elias. Actually your wife. And I intend to act like it." He looked at her for a long moment. And then something happened that happened very rarely on the face of Elias Voss. Something that Harris Cole, watching from the side of the barn, would later tell his wife about, with the specific reverence of a man who has witnessed something private and significant. Elias smiled. A real one. Full and unguarded and completely undefended. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before the heat sets in." Ruth nodded. She turned and went back inside. Elias stood in the yard a moment longer. The summer air was thick and warm around him. Somewhere in the south field, a hawk called once, and then was gone. He thought about Samuel in a field outside Nashville, with his hat pushed back and his rifle on his shoulder, saying the name of a woman Elias had never met, like she was the most important thing he knew. He thought about what Samuel had told him at the very end of that conversation, just before he put his hat back on and walked away. "You're going to be surprised, Elias. That's all I'll say. You're going to be surprised." He had been right. Elias picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. He put it on. He went back inside his house. Their house. And the sound of Ruth in the kitchen, the small, ordinary sound of her moving through a space that was becoming more hers every day, settled in his chest, like something he had not known he was hungry for until she gave it to him. He was done being surprised. He was ready for what came next. She learned to ride on a Tuesday. Elias brought out the quietest horse he had, a brown mare named Patience, which Harris had named with the specific irony of a man who had none. Ruth stood at the fence and looked at the horse, and the horse looked back at her with the large, unhurried eyes of an animal that has learned to take the measure of a person before deciding anything. "She won't throw you," Elias said. "How do you know?" "Because she never has." He held the reins. "Come here." Ruth came to the horse slowly, her hand out the way Elias had shown her, palm flat. Patience dropped her nose and breathed against Ruth's hand, and Ruth stood very still and let it happen. "All right," Ruth said quietly, to the horse more than to Elias. "All right, then." She mounted on the second try. The first try, she got halfway up and came back down and pressed her lips together and did not say anything and tried again. When she was up, she sat straight, her hands on the reins exactly where Elias had placed them, and she looked out over the property from the height of a horse's back for the first time in her life. Elias watched her face. She was looking at the land, the fields, the timberline, the far edge of the eastern quarter where the creek ran. She was looking at it the way she had looked at the ledger documents and the registry papers, like she was memorizing it, filing it, making it part of herself. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "It's bigger every time I look at it," he said. She glanced down at him. "Is that why you fight so hard for it?" "Partly," he said. "Partly it's because I built it when I had nothing, and a man doesn't forget that." He took the lead rope. "Walk on now. Just feel it." She rode for 2 hours that morning. By the end, she was guiding Patience herself through the paddock turns, and her back had found the rhythm, and her hands had gone soft on the reins, the way you go soft on something once you stop being afraid of it. When she dismounted, her legs were unsteady, and she grabbed the fence post and laughed. That real laugh, the surprised one. And Elias stood a foot away with his arms crossed, and watched her laugh at herself with the unself-conscious delight of a woman discovering something she was made for. "Same time tomorrow?" he said. She looked at him, still catching her breath. "Same time tomorrow," she said. That was how September started. The county assessment came back on a Thursday in the third week of September. Harris rode from Nashville with the papers and came into the house without knocking, which he only did when the news was good. "Clean," Harris said, setting the documents on the table in front of Elias. "Full assessment. No disputes lodged, no pending claims." He looked at Ruth, who was at the other end of the table with her coffee and her books. "Thomas Whitmore withdrew his inquiry 2 days ago." Ruth set her cup down. "He withdrew it?" "Quietly," Harris said. "Through his lawyer. No explanation given." She looked at Elias. Elias looked at the documents. His face was still, but his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and is now allowing himself to stop waiting. It's done, Ruth said. It's done, he said. Harris looked between them with the expression of a man attending a moment he understands is significant and is choosing for once to simply let it be. He picked up his hat from the table. "I'll leave you to it," he said. He was gone before either of them could respond. Ruth stood up. She crossed to where Elias was standing, and she put her hand on the documents, flat, palm down, feeling the paper under her hand. "He's not coming back," she said. "Whitmore." "Not for this," Elias said. "What made him pull back?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "A man like Whitmore calculates risk," he said. He calculated that the assessment would complete before Constance could file anything, which meant his angle was gone. And he calculated that pursuing it past that point would cost him more than the land was worth. He paused. "He also had 2 conversations in Nashville last week that I arranged." Ruth looked at him. "What kind of conversations?" "The kind that remind a man how many people he needs on his side in this county, and how few of them he'd have left if he continued." "Harris," she said. "Harris," he confirmed. She shook her head slowly. "You could have told me." "I didn't want you carrying it," he said. "You had enough." She looked up at him. "Elias, I am not a woman who needs to be shielded from the whole truth." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I'm learning." She considered that. Then she nodded once. "Good," she said. "Keep learning." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. She went back to her books. He went back to his ledger. And the house was quiet in the full, inhabited way it had been quiet for months now. The quiet of 2 people in the same space who have stopped pretending they don't know where the other one is at every moment. The twist came from a direction neither of them had been watching. It was a Friday evening in late September when Margaret came to the front room with an expression Elias had learned to read over 15 years. Not alarm, something more complicated. She had a piece of paper in her hand, and she held it out to Ruth, not to Elias. "This came with the postal rider," Margaret said. "Addressed to you, Mrs. Voss." Ruth took it. She looked at the handwriting. She went still. "Who is it from?" Elias said. Ruth turned the paper over. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I don't recognize the hand." She opened it. She read it standing, the way she always read hard things. But this time when she finished, she didn't set it down. She held it. Her hands were not shaking. Her face was not upset. It was something harder to name than upset. "Ruth," Elias said. She looked up. "It's from a man named George Linden," she said. "He was in Samuel's regiment. He was with him at Horseshoe Bend." She stopped. He says he's been trying to find me for months. That Samuel asked him to deliver a message if he didn't come back." She looked down at the paper. "He's in Franklin. He says he has something that belongs to me." The silence in the room was the particular kind that comes when a story you thought you understood reveals that it has another room in it you haven't entered yet. "A message," Elias said carefully. "From Samuel." "A letter," Ruth said. "Not the one Constance has. A different one, written the night before the battle." She looked at him. "George says Samuel made him swear to bring it to me himself, that he didn't trust the post." They rode to Franklin the next morning. George Linden was a young man, barely 22, with the old eyes that men come back from battle wearing, whether they want to or not. He was staying at the inn at the edge of town, and he stood up when they came in and took his hat off, and looked at Ruth with the expression of a man completing an obligation he has carried a long time. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I'm glad I found you." "You found me," Ruth said. "Sit down, Mr. Linden, please." He sat. He reached into his coat and brought out a folded packet, worn at the edges from months of travel, the paper soft with handling. He set it on the table between them.
He gave it to me the night before, George said. He said if he came back, he'd want it destroyed. But if he didn't, I was to put it in your hands and no one else's. He paused. He was very specific about the no one else's. Ruth looked at the packet. She reached out and picked it up. She held it without opening it. "Did you read it?" she asked. "No, ma'am." He sealed it in front of me and told me that was the way it would stay. She nodded. She turned the packet over once. Then she looked at Elias. "Will you give me a moment?" she said. He stood. He and George Linden went to the other side of the room and talked about the road from Nashville, without either of them caring much about the road from Nashville. And across the room, Ruth sat with her cousin's last letter in her hands and read it alone, the way some things need to be read. She was silent for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Not crying, past the point where crying covers it. Something deeper. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth for a moment. Then she lowered her hand and straightened and looked at Elias with the open, undefended face of a woman who has just had something confirmed that she had been afraid to fully believe. She held the letter out to him. He crossed the room. He sat across from her. He took it. He read it. Samuel's handwriting was even and deliberate, every word placed with the care of a man who knows these might be the last words he puts on paper. "Ruth, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it back, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I won't be there. I want you to know some things that I should have said to your face, and was too stubborn or too afraid or too much like every other Adler man to say properly. You are the finest person I have ever known. Not the finest woman, the finest person. You have more grace in you than anyone in our family deserves to claim. And they have spent your whole life taking it from you without giving anything back. And I have let them. And I am sorry for that too. I have asked something of Elias Voss that no man has the right to ask of another. I know that. But Elias is not like other men, and you are not like other women. And I believe, I know, the way I know true things, that if the two of you are ever in the same room long enough, you will find each other. Not because of the promise, despite it maybe, just because that is what truth does when you stop blocking its way. You were never what Aunt Constance said you were. You were never less. You were always more than any of us knew how to hold. Live big, Ruth. Take up the whole room. You've earned it." Samuel Elias folded the letter. He set it on the table between them. The room was very quiet. "He knew," Ruth said. Her voice was not quite steady. "He knew what would happen." "Yeah," Elias said. "He arranged the whole thing, and he knew." "Samuel always knew things before they happened," Elias said. "It was aggravating as hell." He paused. "Pardon." Ruth made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something raw. She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. When she dropped her hand, she looked at George Linden, who had been sitting very quietly in the corner, with the patience of a young man who understands that some moments belong entirely to other people. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping your word to him." George nodded. He turned his hat in his hands. "He talked about you a lot," he said. "At camp, on the road. He'd tell stories about you. Funny ones, mostly. He had a way of telling a story." He looked at the table. "He was a good man, Mrs. Voss. He was the best man in that regiment." Ruth pressed her lips together. "He was the best man in any room he was ever in," she said. They left George with enough coin to see him home, and rode back in the middle of the day, the September sun high and direct. Ruth held the letter inside her coat against her chest and said very little, and Elias rode beside her and gave her the silence she needed, without making her feel alone in it. Halfway home, she said, "He said live big." "He did," Elias agreed. "Take up the whole room."
Yep. She was quiet for a moment. I've been trying. You have, he said. You're getting better at it every day. She looked at him sideways. Is that a compliment from Elias Voss? It's an observation, he said. I'm a careful man. She smiled and rode on. That evening, after supper, after Margaret had gone to her room and the house had settled into the warm dark of a September night, Elias came to the front room and found Ruth at the table. She had Samuel's letter open in front of her, and her hands flat on either side of it, and she was looking at it, not with grief exactly, but with the expression of a person completing something. She looked up when he came in. "Sit with me," she said. He sat across from her. She looked at the letter, then at him. He said, "Not because of the promise," she said. "Despite it, maybe." Yeah. Was he right? Elias held her gaze. He was usually right. Was he right about this? He thought about the porch bench and her hand in his. He thought about the first time she'd laughed in his house, and how he'd stood in the next room afterward, and understood that something had changed that he couldn't unchange. He thought about riding to Nashville for Alderman, and riding to Franklin for Whitmore's man, and riding to Franklin this morning for a dead man's letter. All of it, every mile, not for a promise, but for the specific gravity of this specific woman. Yes, he said, he was right about this. She nodded slowly. She folded the letter one more time and held it in both hands. Then she set it down, and she stood up, and she walked around the table to where he was sitting. She stopped beside his chair and looked down at him with a direct, unflinching gaze that had undone him the first time she turned it on him and had not lost any of its power since. He stood. They were close. The specific close of two people who have been moving toward each other for months and have finally stopped pretending they aren't. "Elias," she said. "Ruth." "I love you," she said, plainly, the way she said everything that mattered, straight, without decoration, without a place to hide. "I know that might be fast. I know we started strange and sideways, and I know the whole thing was built on a dead man's wish. But I love you. I love this house, and this land, and the way you read your ledger, and the way you talk to Harris, and the way you looked at me at Samuel's funeral when you thought I couldn't see you." She held his gaze. "I love you, and I am not afraid to say it." He looked at her for a long moment. His face did the thing it rarely did, went fully, completely open. "Ruth," he said, and his voice was quiet in the way that meant he was using every word with precision. "I have loved you since the morning you walked into that roadhouse and offered to release me from my own promise." He reached up and tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture so familiar now, it felt like a language they had built together. "I just didn't have the sense to say it out loud until now." She reached up and put her hand over his, the one at her face, and held it there. "You could have said it sooner," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I'm saying it now." She kissed him. Not for the first time, not even close to the first time. But this kiss was different from all the others, in the way that things are different once they've been named. It was honest and complete and fully itself, without apology and without performance. When she pulled back, his forehead was against hers. "Samuel is somewhere feeling very pleased with himself," she said. "Samuel is somewhere saying, 'I told you so,'" Elias said. He would have been insufferable about this. She laughed, and he felt it against his chest, that laugh, that real and living sound. The year turned. The harvest came in heavy off the eastern fields, and Elias negotiated the timber contracts himself and brought Ruth to the table for the second meeting because she had read the original terms
and found a clause that would have cost them 3 seasons of revenue. And the men across the table from her did not know what to do with her, and she was completely comfortable with that. Constance Adler did not come to the property again, but in October, Dorothy rode out alone, without her mother, and sat at the kitchen table with Ruth for an hour and a half. Elias did not listen at the door this time. He asked Harris not to ask him what had been said. Some things between women are their own. What he knew was that Dorothy left without the envious, hard-edged look she had always carried when she looked at Ruth. She left looking like someone who has been told a true thing they needed to hear and is still deciding what to do with it. He reckoned that was enough. In November, Harris got married. A woman from Nashville named Frances who had red hair and a sharp tongue, and who looked at Harris with the particular warmth of a woman who has found exactly the right kind of difficult man. The wedding was at the Voss property, and Ruth organized most of it without being asked to, moving through the preparations with the easy authority of a woman who knows this is her home and acts accordingly. At the celebration, Margaret pulled Elias aside and said, with characteristic directness, "She's good for this land. And for you. You should tell her that more often." "I tell her," Elias said. "Men always think they say more than they do," Margaret said, and went back to the food. He told Ruth that evening, when the celebration had quieted, and Harris and Frances had gone, and Margaret had retired, and the house was theirs again. He told her what Margaret had said, and she looked at him with those brown eyes and said, "Margaret is right. You could say it more." "I could," he allowed. "Are you going to?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon I am." She smiled. "Good." The letter came in December, small, official, bearing the seal of the Nashville Land Commission. The assessment was finalized, certified, and filed. The Voss property, 4,218 acres in the county of Williamson, Tennessee, was recorded in the name of Elias Voss and Ruth Voss, joined landholders as of the first day of the new year. Ruth held the document with both hands and read it twice. Her name. Her name in ink on paper that would outlast both of them, attached to this land, to this house, to this life she had walked into with 2 bags and an apology on her lips, and had somehow, without planning it, without even fully believing it was possible, made entirely her own. "It's real," she said. "Was always real," Elias said. "Now it's official." She set the document down. She looked at him across the table. This man she had been afraid of wanting. This man who had stood at the end of a funeral pew and watched a woman sit alone and decided, quietly and completely, that he was not walking away. This man who had kept a promise, not because it was easy, but because it became true. This man whose hands were steady and whose voice was quiet, and who tucked her hair behind her ear like it was the most natural thing in the world, because for both of them, now, it was. She thought about a woman who had arrived at the gate with 2 bags and no expectations, and a lifetime's worth of being told she was not the kind of woman things happened for. She thought about what it had taken to walk through that gate anyway. She thought about Samuel in a field, with his hat pushed back, saying her name to a man he trusted with his life. She thought about what it meant to finally, fully, without reservation, belong somewhere. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping your promise, for letting it become something more than a promise." She held his gaze. "And for seeing me before I could see myself." He came around the table. He took her hand. He held it the way he held everything that mattered to him. Steady, certain, and with no intention of letting go. "Ruth Adler Voss," he said. She looked up at him. "You were never invisible," he said. The world was just looking in the wrong direction. She rose on her toes and kissed him, and he held her close. And outside, the Tennessee winter pressed against the walls of a house that was warm and full and alive with a particular sound of two people who had found, against every odd, exactly where they were meant to be. Samuel Adler had known. He had known before either of them had ever spoken a word to each other. He had known the way he always knew true things, not through magic or luck, but through the simple, clear-eyed understanding of a man who loved two people well enough to see what they could not yet see in themselves. He had been right. He was always right. And in the best and truest ending of his own story, Samuel Adler had given the last and greatest gift a man can give. Not land, not money, not protection, but the belief that the people he loved most were worth fighting for, even from the other side of everything. Ruth and Elias Voss lived on that belief every single day. They chose each other in the morning and at supper, and in the long, quiet evenings, and in every small, honest moment that makes a life real. Not because they had to, not because a promise bound them, but because they had looked at each other clearly, without pretense and without apology, and had decided, freely and completely, that this was the truest thing either of them had ever found. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the whole of it.